Welcome to the Drama Therapy Collection. I'm your host, Kamran Afari. Today's episode explores a topic that challenges some deeply rooted cultural assumptions about relationships, identity, and well-being. In many areas of psychology, therapy, and everyday life, there's often an implicit belief that being single is a temporary state, that people are ultimately searching for a partner, waiting for their right relationship, and somehow incomplete on their own. But what if that assumption doesn't fit everyone? What if for some reason being single is not a transitional phase, but a meaningful and fulfilling way of life? Our guest today is social psychologist Bella DePaulo, whose research has helped bring attention to what she calls singleism, the bias that privileges coupled people and coupled life over those who are single. She also introduces the idea of being single at heart, which is also the title of her published book. People who thrive in single life and experience it not as a compromise, but as an authentic expression of who they are. This conversation was recorded in April 2026 during my graduate seminar in interpersonal communication at Cal State Los Angeles. For drama therapists, narradrama, and narrative therapy practitioners, Bella's work raises important questions. What relationship stories do we assume are universal? What cultural narratives do our clients inherit about love, partnership, and fulfillment? And how can we make room for a wider range of life stories and identities? I hope you enjoy this conversation with Dr. Bella DePaulo. Bella DePaulo is a social psychologist and one of the leading voices in what is now emerging as single studies. Her research spans decades and includes large-scale surveys, qualitative life stories, and a global community of single people rethinking what it means to live life as a full life outside of romantic coupling. Her work asks us to consider, what if the most authentic, meaningful, and psychologically rich life for some people is a single one, not in spite of being single, but because of it?
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you to all of your students for being here to listen. I'm 72 years old and I've been single my whole life. I've never been married. I've never had kids, and I have lived alone ever since finishing graduate school 47 years ago. And I love it. I don't feel like I'm missing anything. I don't feel like my life is a lesser life. And instead, I think I'm living my most authentic life. Single is who I really am. So I'm interested in the people who are powerfully drawn to single life. They are embracing single life for all it has to offer, rather than just avoiding what they might not like about coupling. So for the single at heart, single life is our best life. It is our most authentic, meaningful, fulfilling, and psychologically rich life. We do not want to organize our lives around a romantic partner. We are happy and flourishing because we are single, not in spite of it. To the single at heart, no way of living is as profoundly satisfying as single life. The risk to us who are single at heart is not what we miss by not putting a romantic couple at the center of our lives, but what we would miss if we did. And just an aside now, I purposely put a lot of what I'm saying right on the slide because I will share this presentation with anyone who wants to keep it. And so if you were to open it again, a month or several months from now, you would know what I was saying since I spelled it out rather than trying to reconstruct it. So my research on the single at heart, what you read in my Single at Heart book, comes from the talks I've had informally with single people for decades and decades, an online Facebook group I started. It's called the Single Community of Single People, started in 2015 and now has more than 10,000 members from more than 100 nations. I have published research and writings about single people in academic journals. And I also draw from the research and writings of other scholars. I created a brief online survey, Are You Single at Heart? And that also has been answered by more than 20,000 people in more than 100 nations. And most important, right at the heart of the Single at Heart book are these 41 people who identify as single at heart and who shared their life stories with me. And I'll share many quotes from them as we go along. So the single at heart include people who have never married, never lived with a romantic partner, and never had a serious romantic relationship, as well as people who have had all of those experiences, sometimes over and over again. You know, it's just so drilled into us that we're all supposed to want a romantic relationship and to put that at the center of our lives. That if we get into a serious relationship or even a marriage and it doesn't work, then we keep thinking, well, I didn't do it right, or I didn't find the right person, and just keep on trying. And what I'm trying to say is, you know, if you love your single life, maybe that's your best life. This next one comes from my own experience. So I said I've never been married, but I did when I was much younger. I was in several romantic relationships, and I have no dating horror stories. When I think back to the men that I dated, I still smile. I liked them. But when each of those relationships ended, I was so happy because I got to go back to my one true love, my single life. Now, I thought that was just unique to me, but then when I did the research on people who are single at heart, it turns out that people who are single at heart, if they have dated, and not all of them have, they have that same experience that they, you know, when a relationship ended, maybe they were sad if they liked a person, but they also just felt some relief that they got to go back to who they really are. And the single at heart also include people who found their soulmate, someone they loved deeply, who loved them, but they just found like it didn't compare to being single.
What you've just heard invite us to reconsider some assumptions that often go unquestioned. Many of us have been trained to think of single life primarily in terms of what is missing: a partner, a marriage, a future relationship. Bella DePaulo asks us to consider another possibility, that for some people, single life is not a temporary stage or an unmet goal, but a deeply satisfying way of living. For mental health professionals, this raises an important question. What assumptions do we bring into the room about what a successful or fulfilled life should look like? And how might those assumptions shape the stories we help clients tell about themselves?
So let me tell you what the single at heart love about being single. And I'll do this in two parts. In the first part of the talk, I'll talk about the joyfulness of our lives, getting to live our most authentic life, the psychological richness of our lives, and the opportunity for solitude, which we cherish rather than fear. And a really big one, our freedom. Then in the second half, I'll talk about the people in our lives and the intimacy in our lives. And the two parts of the talk roughly correspond to first chapter of Single at Heart and the intimacy chapter of Single at Heart. Okay, so we find single life joyful. Eva said, I have always lived my most fulfilling, creative, happy, exciting life as a single. And lots of research shows that the single people who want to be single, such as the single at heart, are the happiest single people. Single life is also our most authentic life. Evan said, I feel like my most authentic self when I'm single. And some people said that when they tried to do the expected thing and organize their lives around a romantic partner, it felt unnatural, like role playing, or as Eva said, the wrong size of shoes, just uncomfortable. And that was true even when they were with romantic partners they really liked, maybe even loved. Favoring solitude. Now, I have always loved having time to myself. It never scared me. It never made me feel lonely. It seemed like a great opportunity for resting or relaxing or creativity or productivity or just really thinking deeply or for some people, spirituality is part of solitude. And I thought, okay, the single at heart will mostly agree with me. But what I didn't anticipate was how important it was to every last one of them. When I asked the single at heart people who shared their stories with me, how important, if at all, solitude was to them, every single one of them said it was really important. 3 people said it was like breathing. Acadia said, I feel the most at peace, the most relaxed, the most joyous when I am by myself or just with my cat. I love doing things on my own, seeing movies, going out to dinner, reading, watching TV, and traveling. And because the single at heart find the time they have them to themselves so fulfilling, they rarely feel lonely. And that's a big deal because one of the stereotypes about single people is, oh, we're all so lonely. But those of us who love being single, we cherish the time we have to ourselves. And that means we are rarely lonely. Now, this is a really big one. Every single person who identifies as single at heart says that they appreciate their freedom. And there's so many ways in which freedom matters to us. There's the freedom to learn and grow.
This next section challenges another common assumption. In many clinical and cultural narratives, solitude is often viewed as a warning sign, something that should be reduced or overcome. Yet for many people, solitude is a source of pleasure, reflection, creativity, and renewal. As therapists, educators, and helping professionals, it may be worth asking ourselves, when clients describe satisfaction in a life that includes significant solitude and interdependence, are we able to hear that experience on its own terms, or are we listening through assumptions that equate well-being with partnerships? Let's go back to Dr. DePaulo.
Other freedoms, the single at heart value, financial freedom. The single at heart, like so many other people, single people, can be financially vulnerable. We don't get the financial advantages married people enjoy in the tax system, the federal laws, and when people get a discount, 2 of you pay less per person than one. All those ways in which married people enjoy financial advantages. And of course, single people who live alone cover all their expenses themselves. But it's worth it because we have control over our money. Eleanor said, I love that that my time and my money are my own and I can spend them however I want without having to consult with anyone. Doing meaningful work is another freedom that we value. When asked what they would choose if they had to decide between meaningful work that did not pay much or uninspiring work that paid a lot, the single at heart were more likely to choose meaningful work, which to me is really telling because they're more financially vulnerable. So you might think they would lunge at the work that paid more. Peggy said this. I love this. She said, I am mostly retired now, managing my own small business taking care of animals. It has been my favorite way to earn money. When I told people I was leaving corporate to have a pet sitting business, no one was impressed or even happy for me. They thought if I hired others, then I would be a manager again, and that would be impressive. I told them if I did that, I would just be managing people with all that stress, which I hated. They would get to spend all their time with the animals. Another freedom, getting to be the deciders. Amy said, I love deciding everything about my life, contributing to our communities. Some people think, oh, if you like freedom, that means you're selfish. But what people use their freedom to do includes contributing to our communities. Yolanda said, sometimes I think about how instead of starting to date as a teenager, I spent much of my time volunteering as a math and writing tutor, and I still volunteer today over a decade later. Caring for our people. This next person, David, who was 65 when he told me his story, he was caring for his father in his last few years. And look what he said. It was an honor to help him. And then another freedom we appreciate is the freedom to chart our own life course. So instead of doing get married, have kids, have grandkids, the single at heart decide for themselves how their lives will unfold. When I asked Sonia about this, she gave me this long list of what her life has entailed. I won't read it. But the point is, you get to figure it out for yourself and do what you find most meaningful. Another thing we value is choosing our spaces, our places, and our homes. That David, the same person I mentioned before, said, now that I'm through with my workplace work, I'm moving to New Mexico where I can live amongst the natural environments of desert, mountains, big skies with sunsets and sunrises that I can actually watch. And now, a couple years later, he has done just that. And he's an award-winning filmmaker who has filmed in the desert and set it to music. It's beautiful. Reimagining holidays is another freedom. Some people think, oh, you poor single person, you don't have a spouse to do holidays with. Well, Evan said, I feel free to spend holidays and vacations as I wish. I don't feel obligated to go home to repetitive and uninspiring holiday traditions. I loved my holiday traditions. I actually loved going home to my parents and siblings, and my mother would put on this big spread and invite a whole room full of people. And I love that. But I also like doing my own thing. So, here, and then the final freedom I want to mention is curating our everyday lives. So Andrea said, I like going to bed when I want, no one interrupting my sleep, waking up when I want, eating what I want, when I want, exercising when I want, how I want. I don't have to feel guilty about wanting to do something on my own. There are no interruptions or distractions while I'm reading or meditating. I purposely put this one last because if you were to ask single people, just grab them off the street and say, what do you like about being single? They would say something like this. I like the freedom to get up when I want and eat what I want, keep my house the way I want, all that. And that's important, in a day-to-day life. I appreciate that. But what I try to do by showing you all those different freedoms is to show that the freedoms of being single can be much more profound than that. They mean living your life in a way that is true to yourself. Okay, so now I want to show you an 8-minute interview of a woman named Joan Delfatore, who really captures what it means to be single at heart. She's a scholar of singlehood. She is writing a really important book about how single people are treated in the healthcare system. She shared this with me 3 years ago when I was giving a talk to mental health professionals, and she gave me permission to use it again now. So let's take a look at Joan.
Hello, my name is Joan Delfatore. As Bella may have told you, I'm part of the community of writers who publish work about what it means to live single in a couples-oriented culture. My work tends to focus on issues in healthcare. Bella was kind enough early on to publish the first things that I wrote on her blog on Psychology Today. So Bella, thank you very much for getting me started. My role today is to talk about something I wrote about that was on Bella's blog, about an encounter I had with a licensed clinical psychologist about 40 years ago. I was in my mid-30s, I'm now 76. To her credit, it was a very positive experience, and that was not to be taken for granted. I think it's fair to say that 40 years ago, the psychology profession was in some ways an outpost of the patriarchy. It was a promoter of heteronormative assumptions about how everybody wanted to live. The reason I went to see her is that I was in my mid-30s and I had absolutely no interest in finding a romantic partner. Now, bear in mind, for somebody who was born in 1946, growing up in the 1950s and early 60s, it's not just that it was not acceptable for a woman not to be a wife and mother, it was not thought of as possible. A woman, by definition, was a wife and mother, and I never saw myself in those roles. It's not that I thought there was anything wrong with being a wife or mother. I don't think there's anything wrong with being a surgeon or being a test pilot, but I don't see myself in those roles. But an identity for a woman that did not include wifehood and motherhood was simply not on the radar screen. So by my mid-30s, as you can imagine, there was great terror and anxiety and panic and distress because I wasn't married. I had a PhD. I was a tenured associate professor at the University of Delaware, had a very good life, but I wasn't married, and that was sending everybody up the drapes. So I thought, maybe I am missing something. Maybe there is something wrong. I mean, all the voices were telling me that I was supposed to want something, and my own voice was saying I didn't want it, and it created a conflict. So I went to a psychologist, again, licensed clinical psychologist. She's about 10 years older than I am. She was very happily married. At the time, she had teenage kids. And both of us started the therapy with an understanding that we would both be open-minded. So I wasn't starting with the premise, I'm absolutely never getting married, and she wasn't starting with the premise that that's the only healthy thing I possibly could do, which again, to her credit, was not something you could take for granted 40 years ago. So we went through a good deal of talking about all kinds of things for a few months. The turning point came one day when she was asking me about what I would look for in marriage. We had already established that I am cisgender and heterosexual. And I am not asexual. I do respond sexually to men, but I wasn't willing to organize my life around it. It wasn't important enough to me to live in a way that I otherwise would not want to live. So she asked me, if you did get married, what kind of a man would you look for? And I said, well, I would look for a man who has a challenging job that he loves, who plays sports, who is involved in community activities, does a lot of volunteer work. So she said, so you would be looking for a man who's intellectually stimulating. I said, no, I'd be looking for a man who's never home. So at that point, we started talking about the reality. I had a very good life. The only reason I was even thinking about changing my lifestyle was other people's opinion about what I should be doing. So we ended up with the agreement, mutual agreement at the end of the therapy, that as long as I could put up with the nonsense that a single person has to tolerate from other people who don't understand that some of us really don't want to be a wife and mother, as long as I could deal with the external pressure. If it ain't busted, don't fix it. I was fine. Let me just quickly define what I mean by fine. To start with the thing that everybody asks about, I do have several very close friends, I'd say about 6. I would call close friends, people who do things together. We go to concerts, we go to plays, we have dinner, we have lunch. But we also talk about important things. What's going on in our life? How do we feel about it? We tell each other things I think we would not tell other people. As it happens, I am just now back from a lunch with 4 of those friends. They took me out to lunch today to celebrate my official discharge from cancer treatment at Sloan Kettering, or I should say from cancer monitoring. The treatment ended some time ago. So they were looking for a gift that would symbolize life and hope and rebirth. They did some research to find out what would symbolize those things, and they gave me a bunny. I also have friends who I'd say are kind of the next circle out. We get along well, we do things together. For example, I'm very active with my Rotary Club. We're doing a big fundraising project for furnishing shelters in Ukraine. So I'm spending a good deal of time on that. I'm involved in a political issue in my state, trying to stop the state from privatizing the retirees' health care benefits. But as important as all that is, it isn't the only thing that matters. Yes, those reciprocal relationships are important. It is important to me that if, let's say, I need a ride to the doctor, it's not purely functional. It's not transactional, find someone to give me a ride. These are people who are part of my life. I do things for them as well. It's integral. It all fits together, and that matters. But it's not the only thing that matters. The other thing that's very, very important to a happy single life is solitude. In our extroverted culture, solitude, I think, does not get the credit it deserves. Part of the reason for solitude is to be able to do things such as writing articles that you wouldn't be able to do with a lot of commotion going on. But there's also a value in having access to the inside of one's own head, being present, being aware of being with oneself the way you would be aware of being with someone else. I think that tends to be undervalued or even treated as abnormal. It's not. I think there's a continuum with an abnormal need for other people at one end and an abnormal need for solitude at the other end. But in the middle of that continuum, there is a range, not a pinpoint ideal, but a range of normal behavior. And those of us who thrive living single really need that solitude, privacy, autonomy, that are, to a degree that is not consistent with a shared life. So that's my 2 cents. I thank you very much for being at this program today. As I said, there was a time when therapists were not interested in hearing about why people might actually want to be single. You know, if you have not experienced this, I'm not sure I can explain what it's like when you define your identity and other people deny it. They assume that when you say what you really are and what you really want, they say either you're lying or you're deceiving yourself. So you say, I am a naturally happy single person, and they say, no, you're not. Where do you go with that? So again, thank you for being there. Bella has my contact information. Bella, it's fine to share it if people have follow-up questions they want to ask, and I wish you well with the conference. Thank you. Bye-bye.
So there are, I've been talking about what's great about being single, but there are challenges too. And it would take a whole other talk for me to go over all the challenges single people face, and not just the single at heart. There's all the stereotyping, stigmatizing, marginalizing of single people, discrimination against them, which I call singleism. And there are whole systems of inequality that advantage coupled people, especially if they're married, and disadvantage single people. But for today, I'll just mention some small, not the big things, but some little examples. And this is following up on what Dr. Delfator said, that if you are a single at heart person and you tell somebody that you love being single and you want to stay single, they'll say things like, "Oh, that's not really true. You're just fooling yourself. You just haven't met the right person. You think that now, but you will change your mind."
What follows shifts our attention from individual experiences to cultural expectations. Many single people report being questioned, corrected, or encouraged to see their lives as incomplete. These messages can be subtle, but they're remarkably persistent. Bella DePaulo refers to this pattern as singleism. For mental health professionals, this invites careful reflection. We may recognize these assumptions in our communities, our institutions, and perhaps even in our own training. The challenge is not simply to identify singleism in society, but to examine whether it influences the questions we ask, the goals that we prioritize, and the futures that we imagine for the people we serve.
And one of the things I suggest and illustrate in my Single at Heart book is when you hear things like that, flip the script and show what it would be like if somebody said that to married people. That, "Oh, you just think they say they're happily married and you say, 'Oh, you're just fooling yourself. You don't really mean that.'" You wouldn't do it. And that's how you know it's inappropriate to do to single people. So that's everyday life. But sometimes that kind of negative and dismissive thinking shows up even in the most prestigious publications. And one of the most prestigious publications in the world, I think, is the New York Times. And they had this art. Now, this was a wonderful topic. Over 60, single and never happier. I was so happy that the New York Times did a story on this. And that's a great headline. But now look at what they put for their subheadline. "Why some older people who have given up looking for romantic love say they feel self-assured and satisfied on their own." Well, that's a negative spin, giving up on romantic love. I'm not single because I gave up on romantic love. I wasn't pursuing that kind of love. It's kind of like what Joan Delfator said about, she didn't want to be a test pilot. And she wasn't single because she didn't want to be a test pilot, but because she wanted to be single. Same thing here. But in other ways, it was a really good article. And one of the reasons it was so good is because the journalist talked to a very smart and perceptive person who you will recognize. Isn't that a great picture? That was in the New York Times, and your professor gave some great insights into being over 60, single, and happy. So now I want to get to the topics of the people in our lives, the role of sex in the lives of people who are single, and love. So the Single at Heart embrace bigger, broader meanings of relationships and love. Coupled people often are said to have the one. But many single people have the ones, and they often maintain those relationships. So research has shown that single people have more friends. They are also really good at staying in touch with their friends, their neighbors, their parents, more so than married people. And research shows that when people get married, now, not all of them do this, but on average, typically, they become more focused on each other and they spend less time with their friends. They call their parents less often. They basically become more insular, while single people are maintaining their connections. And another thing that people say that is dismissive of single people as, oh, you're single, you're unattached. Well, that's not true either. Single people have genuine attachment relationships with the most important people in their lives. So if you've studied attachment theory, you know what the key criteria are for a genuine attachment relationship. And single people meet those criteria. Um, the approach to people in our lives is different. So the journalist Rebecca Traister was explaining to Roxane Gay, a best-selling author, how prioritizing her boyfriend and then marrying him had changed her. And she said, "It's not that I loved my friends any less, but I couldn't maintain that level of daily commitment to them if I was also going to make room for my boyfriend." So she was describing her personal experience of a common phenomena, how people who become coupled often marginalize their friends. Well, people who are single at heart don't do that. We don't want to put a romantic partner at the center of our lives. So we're never going to demote our friends to accommodate our partner. You know how that goes. You have these close friends, they were all single, and some of them get coupled, and then when you used to be invited for dinner or for weekend things, now you get demoted to lunch, or maybe you get kind of moved out entirely. Okay, now let's talk about sex in the lives of the single at heart. The single at heart do not want to organize their lives around a romantic partner, but still, liking lots of sex is not incompatible with the single at heart life. Alyssa said, "I love being head over heels for someone, and it's such a fun time to explore sexual chemistry and all that. I adore having emotionally close, loving relationships. But I also love my social community and my own space. I like having the freedom to take off without having to check in with people or have someone keep tabs on me. I'm just very independent and have always been happier without conventionally entangled and meshed relationships. In typical monogamous language, I prefer casual relationships and have no desire to cohabit, join finances, get married, and so forth." So the single at heart include people who are totally uninterested in dating or casual romantic relationships, as well as those who enjoy dating, but make it clear to potential partners that they do not want to ride what is sometimes called the romantic relationship escalator all the way to the top floor, where couples move in together, merge finances and lives, get married, maybe have kids. But the single at heart also include people who have never had sex and never wanted to, as well as people who like having sex, maybe lots of it, and sometimes different kinds of sexual experiences. Now, let me show you a few examples of how sex fits into the lives of the single at heart. Kristen said, "I have a great toy box, and every once in a while I take out my old battery-powered friends." Evan, who's 40s, he sometimes goes on dates and he likes meeting new people, but he lets them know from the outset that he's not looking for a committed long-term relationship. Donna said, I have had lots of relationships and short-term encounters that would have been hard to do in the frame of monogamy. Jessica describes herself as sexually open-minded and loves to explore. And she experiments with different kinds of sex, including some kinds that people might be judgmental about. Andrea told me that when she was in college, she loved having hookups. She said, "We only interacted between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m., and there was vulnerable conversation, which I valued, in addition to sex. I was aware that I was supposed to feel unsatisfied with this arrangement, but I was actually 100% content with it. The compartmentalization left me with uncompromised free time to study, participate in clubs, and hang out with friends. And that last part is a theme I heard a lot from people who are single at heart. They want to have big lives filled with, things they can attend to, their passions, their interests, their friends, their family, and so forth. Another way of being single at heart is to be into solo polyamory. So solo poly people are open to a number of meaningful relationships without prioritizing one person as the primary partner. In the New York Times Modern Love column, one person said, "I liked how solo polyamory cherished and prioritized autonomy and the preservation of self. And I found its rejections of traditional models of romantic love freeing." She said that her choice was to be single and not looking, but very much loving. Now, some people are asexual, and those are people with little to no sexual attraction to other people. And I found my favorite example on social media. It says this: "To people who don't get asexuality, think of someone you aren't attracted to." Now imagine that's how you feel about everyone. The end. Now, that's a little too simplistic because it's more of a continuum, but that gives you the idea of what that is. And, if you're not getting sex, that's not going to bother you if you don't want it. Now, let me show you, I hope this one works now, a brief 4-minute discussion by someone who is a leading voice for the asexuality movement and who is also a model.
I'm doing an interview for a really cool Australian magazine's website called Ramona. And they were asking me some really interesting questions, and I was like, I think these would make a pretty cool video, actually. They asked, as somebody who is trying to raise awareness for asexuality, what do I wish more people understood about asexuality? And my wish is such a simple one. One thing that I really wish that people understood about asexuality is just that it's an option. And no, I don't mean it's an option in the sense that it's a choice. It's just that our society is really heteronormative, and that is improving in the sense that people are coming to terms with the fact that some people aren't heterosexual, some people are homosexual, some people are bisexual, some people are pansexual, but it's still kind of about the sexual. So if you're not sexual, where do you fit into the narrative? I also feel like our society is becoming increasingly hypersexualized. And that's partially because people are more sexually liberated nowadays, and don't get me wrong, that's a good thing. But I also think it's because industries have realized that sex really sells, and the more you emphasize it, the more money you're gonna make. And so they put these messages into the public sphere, and the public feel like they have to kind of conform to these sexual standards and behaviors. In my humble opinion. In a society that's so focused on sex, I genuinely feel like people don't even compute that asexuality is a thing. I genuinely think that there are more asexual people out there than most would originally assume. They just don't know that asexuality is an option in a society that places so much emphasis on sexuality. I mean, the usual assumption is that there's something wrong with you. Like, you have some kind of personal issues, and that feeds into your intimacy issues, but it's something that you should be able to overcome either with medication or by finding the right person. Like, all you need is that good D or that good V, and all of your problems will go away. That is assuming that asexuality is a problem. And that's something that I really want to dispel. Asexual people don't have a problem. They're perfectly fine. You can be a complete person who has fulfilling interactions and relationships with other people without having sex and without wanting to have sex. and even without wanting to be romantically involved with somebody. You're not broken, you're not boring, you're not undesirable, and you're definitely not unnatural because you're asexual. Asexuality isn't this weird thing that happens to people who have been abused. It's not another way of saying that you're in the closet. It doesn't mean that you have some weird sexual thing and you just don't want to be open about it. And it's not because you're unattractive, it's not because you're undesirable, and it's not because you haven't been liberated. And asexuality is what it is. And asexual people are what they are. And it's not a problem, and it isn't the side effect of some kind of issue. And in a society where everything is about sex, being asexual is okay, and you can just do that. So yeah, that's what I wish more people understood about asexuality. And that signals the end of this public service announcement. I will provide a link to my interview with Ramona when it's up. We don't just talk about asexuality. We talk about being an alternative black model, we talk about racism, we talk about sexism, we talk about a whole bunch of interesting stuff. So I'm going to link that in my Instagram when the interview's out, and hopefully you guys will be interested in checking it out. Thanks for watching. I have to go kill a spider now.
Yeah. So I just want to end by talking a little bit more about love and intimacy. Historically, love has been construed much more broadly. It's not just about romance. So Jay Gillis, the historian, said, romantic love has never been more valued than it is right now. Romance is not new, but never has it been so exclusively symbolized by the love between just two people. In earlier centuries, it had been possible to imagine love in other ways, in relationships between friends, in bonds with spiritual figures, in various kinds of religious and secular communities. And for single at heart people too, love and intimacy are thought about in much broader ways. So Carla said, I am often overwhelmed by how much love is in my life. From my friends, my family, and the animals I'm so lucky to know. I think a lot of people think that if you don't have romantic love, you're missing something. But having had it in the past, I can safely say I feel that I have more love in my life now than when I was coupled. Sonia, who's a school teacher, said, I love my blood family. I love my chosen family. I love my students, my pets, and pursuing my creative endeavors. My family, pets, and friends love me. My students love me. And finally, about intimacy, Kristen said, when people share their deepest sorrows, fears, and joys with you, that's intimacy. Giving people long hugs is intimacy. Now, finally, I just want to read from you one of the last paragraphs in my Single at Heart book. My mission in putting the Single at Heart on the map is to rewrite what it means to be single. Single life, to those of us who are single at heart, is a joyful place, a place to learn and grow. It is a big-hearted, expansive, meaningful life, full of possibilities. We love and care for people beyond just romantic partners and are loved and cared for in return. Intimacy to us is personal. In that domain, as in all others, we follow our hearts rather than the cultural rule books. We chart our own life courses with meaningfulness, psychological richness, and authenticity as our guides. Thank you for listening, and I am happy to take any questions you have.
In this final section, Bella DePaulo broadens the conversation about intimacy, about connection and love. Rather than centering all meaningful connection around romantic partnership, she highlights the many ways people build lives of care, commitment, belonging, and affection. For clinicians, this perspective encourages us to remain open to the diverse forms that intimacy can take. It asks us to recognize that meaningful connection may be found in friendships, in chosen family, in creative communities, in service, in spirituality, and many other relationships that do not fit conventional expectations. And it reminds us that our role is not to prescribe a particular life path, but to support people in creating lives that are authentic and meaningful to them. What Bella DePaulo offers us is not simply a different perspective on singlehood. She invites us to examine a set of assumptions that are often so familiar they become invisible. For mental health professionals, educators, and helping practitioners, that examination is especially important. When we assume that partnership is the preferred destination for everyone, we may unintentionally overlook other pathways to fulfillment, connection, and flourishing. This conversation challenges us to broaden our understanding of what constitutes a meaningful life, and to recognize the many ways that people create belonging, intimacy, purpose, and joy. If this conversation resonates with you, I encourage you to explore Bella DePaulo's books, articles, and ongoing work on singleism and the concept of being single at heart. I also encourage you to learn about the Bella DePaulo Foundation for Empowerment of Single People. The foundation supports academic, artistic, educational, and community-based projects that expand understanding of single lives and challenge stereotypes about singlehood. Through its grants program, it provides resources for scholars, artists, and advocates whose work advances these goals. If this mission speaks to you, consider applying for a grant or supporting funded projects and making a donation to help sustain this important work. Because sometimes the most important task is not helping people fit a prescribed story, but remain open to the many stories through which human beings create meaningful lives. This has been the Drama Therapy Collection.